You know, it never fails to amaze me how the Spirit of God is at work in His people. Never fails to amaze me. For a second there, I thought Margaret was going to steal my thunder entirely about the sermon. And it's perfect because today we are going to be talking about that the last. We're right at the last bit of that early part of Romans where we start to transition to now. Okay, how do we do this? How do we do faith? If this is the gospel, how do we do it? And we're right at the last few little segments of text before we get there. And so today, as we continue our series in Romans, I kind of titled it The Depths of Grace, but really what we're going to be looking at is remnant theology. I mentioned that to someone, they're like, who, but what theology? Well, we're going to talk about what it is, and we're going to talk about what is how it and the gospel are connected, and then we're going to talk about how it's relevant to us today. Because, bit of a spoiler, Margaret hit the nail on the head. It actually has something a lot to do with community health and communion, which is kind of neat. So let's open with a word of prayer, and we'll read our scriptures. Heavenly Father, as we gather today to read your word, to reflect, to learn, to enrich our minds, our hearts, and our lives with your presence, may our ears be open, may our hearts be welcome to your word as you reach us. Regardless of the quality of what we hear, may we meet with you over today's lesson and today's worship. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay. Romans chapter 10. And I've actually chosen a long chunk today because it kind of captures the same theme, and I wanted to kind of get it blocked so we can get into Paul's talk about the vine and the wild grafting and is God's plan, big picture for Israel. So Romans 10, 14 through 11:10, lots of reading. Stay with me. Okay. How then will they call on him in whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe in him of whom they have not heard? And how are they to hear without someone preaching? And how are they to preach unless they're sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach the good news. But they have not all obeyed the gospel. For Isaiah says, Lord, who has believed what he has heard from us? So faith comes from hearing, and hearing through the word of Christ. But I ask, have they not heard? Indeed they have, for their voice has gone out to all the earth, and their words to the ends of the world. But I ask, did Israel not understand? First, Moses says, I will make you jealous of those who are not a nation. With a foolish nation, I will make you angry. Then Isaiah is so bold as to say, I have been found by those who did not seek me. I have shown myself to those who did not ask for me. But of Israel he says, all day long I've held my hand out. I've held out my hands to a disobedient and contrary people. I ask then, has God rejected his people? By no means, for I myself am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, a member of the tribe of Benjamin. God's not rejected his people whom he foreknew. Do you not know what the scriptures say of Elijah? How he appeals to God against Israel? Lord, they've killed your prophets, they've demolished your altars, and I alone am left, and they're seeking my life. But what is God's reply to him? I have kept for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. So too at the present time there is a remnant chosen by grace. But if it is by grace, it is no longer on the basis of works. Otherwise, grace would no longer be grace. What then? Israel failed to obtain what it was seeking. The elect obtained it, but the rest were hardened. As it is written, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes that would not see, and ears that would not hear, down to this very day. And David said, let their table become a snare and a trap, a stumbling block and a retribution for them. let their eyes be darkened so that they cannot see, and bend their backs forever. Whew, dark ending. So when we talk about remnant theology, Paul here draws a strong connection between the Old Testament and the New. So as we look at it, what I realized, so I was sitting home this week, was that when we look at the text, Romans 9:4, it says Israel's is the adoption to sonship. Theirs is the divine glory. They get God's glory, the glory of God, the covenants, the receiving of the law, the temples worship, the promises, all the knife and the law, the presence of God, the worship right, all the things that are the trappings of faith that should have brought him into a living relationship with God, but just became hollow religion sometimes. They had all of that. And so Paul, in a very real way, kind of walks us through from Genesis to the incarnation in the book of Romans. But, and the realization that, oh, of course, that explains it. Because when we get to remnant theology, it's this idea that there is a faithful select that have been faithful to God regardless of adversity. They saw God for who he was regardless of their faith and of their religion and their culture and their religion. The remnant were the Jews that were faithful no matter what. The Hebrew word for it, for sha'ar, is very interesting. Like it basically means the shoot. But the remnant is picked up. We see it first in the book of Isaiah, where they're pictured as a small group of Israelites who survived the invasion of the Assyrian army under Tiglath-Pileser III. Try saying that twice. In Isaiah chapter 10. And the remnant is promised that they will one day be brought back to the land of promise by God himself in Isaiah 11, by this figure called the root of Jesse, which is a reference both to the Davidic line, to David himself, and to the Messiah eventually. Isaiah again uses the terminology during Sennacherib's siege of Jerusalem in Isaiah 37. Again, they're the faithful few that survived the invasion. They stayed faithful and trusted God through the turmoil. The concept of the remnant is actually also not just Isaiah, though. It's all throughout the Old Testament. It's picked up by many of the other prophets, Micah, Jeremiah, Zephaniah, specifically Jeremiah 39 and 40. The poor people who had nothing, who remained in Judah while the rich and the controlling and the powerful were exported, they were considered the remnant. And in post-exilic literature, Ezra, Nehemiah, Haggai, Zechariah, they consistently refer to the Jews who returned from captivity as the remnant. So it's interesting because when we talk about the remnant, God's faithful few who, regardless of and difficult times, stayed in this living, vibrant relationship with him, are painted in very different ways. They survived the invaders. They were carried off and brought back. They stayed faithful in a foreign land. They're the people who were poor, not the people who were privileged. And the language of it is used several times, but the concept remains the same. That as we talk about the remnant, they are the people whose hearts were tuned to God's heart. And Paul references earlier, he says, not all of Israel is Israel, Romans chapter 9, right? We just came through that. And he quotes Elijah because Elijah himself dials into this reality. And we saw earlier about Jacob and Esau, Isaac and Ishmael, Ruth and Naomi, and their journey, like the Moabitess, who's somehow an Israelite. Like it's just, how did the people of God become not this heritage, this lineage? And Elijah puts his finger on it. He goes, all these people have turned away from you. I'm the remnant. I'm it. I'm all that's left. And God goes, Elijah, you're just worried and scared, buddy. I've saved 7,000 men. Now, the word thousand could also be translated as clans or groups. But the point is that God says, no. I've kept my loved ones close. I've kept my chosen few to weather the storm. You're not alone. And so this is the Old Testament picture of the remnant, the faith that stares down the barrel of tragedy and oppression, struggle, uncertainty, persecution, and holds true, holds fast to God. So that's the Old Testament. But what does Paul do with it? Well, that's a good question. When Paul picks this up, Paul picks up on these threads of that just because not all of Israel is Israel, and what Elijah had to say and what the prophets say. In fact, this text is riddled with quotes out of Isaiah 52, 53, Isaiah 65, Deuteronomy 29, Isaiah 44, Psalm 69. Honestly, if you don't have the cross-references in your Bible, which some of us have, some of us don't, if you take the quoted section, just plug it into Google, it tells you where you find it in the Old Testament. And there's some really great content. But Paul, again, canonically, the whole Bible, he starts pulling out these verses to kind of demonstrate the point. He says that the remnant were a people chosen by grace, not on the basis of works. Isaiah 65 specifically, where he says that they call on God, they hear God, they see God, and they encounter God through the midst of everything. And one of the hardest lessons that we can learn in the life of faith is that when suffering and pain, when struggle come your way, when grief and restrictions and uncertainty are in your life, do you take that pain and suffering and hurt into your relationship with God? Or do you try to keep it out of your relationship with God? Do you go to God with your struggles, or do you try to keep your struggles out and you go somewhere else with your pain, into a bottle, into drugs, into pretending it's not real? These are the things we can and sometimes tend to do as humans. And I think if we're going to be very honest about our faith, I'm going to say two things about that. One, first, God can handle anything and everything you're feeling, anything and everything you're going through. He is comfortable with your anger and pain and frustration and resentment and bitterness and lack of forgiveness. Whatever it is that you're experiencing and feeling, He knows perfectly and is not worried about it. He just wants you to bring it to Him. That's the first thing. The second thing I'd say about that is that it's not like He doesn't know it's there. When we close that off from Him, when we take efforts to try to hide that we're struggling, the only person who experiences the pain there is us. We lose and we suffer more. You know, in medical terms, it's somewhat like forming an abscess. The infection gets hidden but doesn't go away. It just festers and gets gross until you can't contain the grossness of it anymore. And it either kills you or you eventually break and need healing, need freedom, need the pressure to come off. So Paul sees this and he says, no, the remnant, the people that lean into God with their pain and their struggle, they are the remnant. This is what they look like. And conversely, in his quotes, we look at them. Paul lists who the dead wood are, who the people that are not connected. Right? Not the shoot of Jesse, the chosen ones, the remnant, the vibrant, but where's the dead wood of the community of faith? And he runs this list. Romans 11:8 he refers to them as stupor out of Isaiah 44, that they are people that do not hear. They don't hear God. That's in 11 verse 8. It's also in 10 verse 18. He says that they do not see. He says that twice in 11:8 and in chapter 10. He says that they are jealous and angry. Deuteronomy 32 verses 19 in chapter 10. And he says that God holds his hand out to a disobedient and contrary nation out of Isaiah 65, which is chapter 10, verse 21. And then he drops this verse and this quote out of Psalm 65, that their comfort is a trap. 11, verse 9. And you're like, wait a minute. Or sorry, he doesn't say the comfort. Their table is a trap. Sorry. I ruined that one. When you sit down at a table, in the Jewish tradition, the tables were very low to the ground, foot or so off the ground. And so it was very normal when you were eating to lay down. A couple of cushions, lay back. It's a relaxed, comfortable thing that you did. You didn't sit at a table with a fork and knife and napkins and 7 spoons and 14 knives and 6 cups, and I still have no idea what the heck all that stuff is about. And that's okay. I mean, the point is that the table was not a place of propriety, of properness, of impressive behavior. The table was a place of comfort, of community, of connection. It was a place of relaxing. You know, at the Last Supper, it says that the one that was sitting at the table with Jesus, John, who we call John, the beloved, who sat with him at the table, the word they use is this really funny Greek word, sunanakaimai. It means to literally sit up against. And I love the image. John, beloved, at the Last Supper, sat up, leaned into Jesus at the Last Supper. It's very plausible he could have just leaned in a little more and heard Jesus' heartbeat as they were eating dinner. This is not uncommon in that culture and time, that the table was a place where you relaxed. It's a place where you showed affection and love and spent time together. And so Paul says here that their comfort, their table is a trap. Their comfort. They get complacent. They get lazy. They think that everything's just fine. And it's a trap. Complacency in our faith is dangerous. Comfort is dangerous. God does not call us into comfort. He calls us into peace. And we may experience comfort, but that's the gift, not the calling. That's the blessing, not the requirement. If you're comfortable in your faith, you have to ask yourself, why? Why am I comfortable? If you're not growing and wrestling, if you're not disciplining your faith, the comfort is a better mark of something else, which we call lazy. And this word at the top, stupor, I don't know, who knows what that word even means? If you're under 16, you probably think it means something, what, is it like connected to stupid? Is it like, what does that even mean? It's a state of near unconsciousness and insensitivity. You're just kind of like out of touch with everything that's around you and going on. You're in a stupor. And in 11 verse 10, he opens with this, they are a people of stupor. And he says, may their table be, their comfort is a trap. And at the end he says that they would always have a bent back, meaning loaded with burdens, heavy with sorrows and work. Let their table become a snare and a trap. David says, let the deadwood, let those who don't walk with God, let their comfort become a problem to them, a stumbling block and a evidence that they're just being lazy. Let them not see, and their backs be bent forever, that they've weighed down with the weight of it. Not because David wishes ill on them, But he says this is the consequence. This is what it looks like if you aren't in a vibrant relationship with Jesus. You end in a place of grief and sorrow and maybe comfort for a season, but at the end of the day, it backfires because it doesn't bring you peace. Maybe the appearance of it, but not the substance of it. Wow, Paul, that's kind of brutal. I mean, that if that's what he's saying, that's what he's setting up in Romans chapter 10 and 11, that if we try to do faith by works, it's going to result in just this abysmal looking picture. But if we walk by grace, that then we can hear God, see God, encounter God, live in grace. And yet, he says there are still people who have chosen that in the Jewish tradition, in the Jewish heritage. So what does that mean for us today? I mean, we talked about the Old Testament of the remnant. We talked about Paul's use of the remnant. So what does it mean for us, you and me? Okay, well, here's where it gets fun. For me, not for you. This is the uncomfortable part for you. When we take this remnant, this theology of, because Paul's talking about Jews and Gentiles, right? I mean, he's talking about people who grew up in the faith, knew the promises, knew the law, walked in it, and yet some have turned to Jesus and some have turned away from Jesus. Some have turned to comfort, and some have said, no, I'm going to embrace this path of denial, this path of accepting suffering and putting it in context. That Jesus suffered, therefore I will likely suffer. That suffering is a normal part of health because it means that my pain is not only brings me closer to God, but might accomplish the purpose of God in my life and other people's lives. That's a hard one. But that's where Paul's going. He says these Jews and these Gentiles. So that was the first century church. How do we get these two groups of people to make peace with each other? He goes, well, here's the thing. You were all chosen by grace. You're all the remnant. You were called out from the Gentile nations. You were called out from the Jewish nations. You are one people. And how do you come to peace with this? Because you are not people meant to be jealous or angry, not meant to be disobedient or contrary. You're not meant to be seeking your comfort. You're meant to be seeking God, to see God, to hear God, to encounter God, and not look at each other on the basis of your works, on the basis of your impressiveness and your togetherness, but on the basis of your walk by grace. You are meant to walk by grace. And so when we talk about the remnant today, for today's church, what relevancy is that? Well, not all Israel is Israel. Not all the church is the church. There are people you've grown up with in faith that have the right behaviors that may not have that depth of relationship with Jesus. There are people you will meet in church that are not Christians. And that's not bad. Because here's where it's different. Because as much as we want to say that the church is the remnant, maybe in the first century church it was, but today it's not. There's so much culture of Christianity that we are actually much more in this story between Jew and Gentile. We are much more in the camp of Jew than we are in the camp of Gentile. We are much more the people who have inherited the promise, that know the laws, that know the religious observances. We are the modern day nation of Israel. The church, big picture, is that. And we are that call out to not be dead, but to come and be alive is perennial, is constant in the church. Come and be met, come and be known. So regardless of how you see it, the remnant theology that was active in the Old Testament applies to us, just like the same remnant theology in Romans applies to us, because we have to ask the hard question, which one am I more like in my faith? And we can use this to take our temperature, but here's the difference between Israel, Old Testament, Paul in the New Testament, us today. You're not stuck, people. If your encounter with people brings out jealousy and anger, if you find you're tending to be disobedient and contrary, if you find you're being a little senseless of other people, stupor, a little senseless and unobservant and uncaring about others, if you just want comfort, take that as your thermometer of where your spirituality is at. And think, not just think, but choose to come back to grace. Richard Rohr, a Catholic mystic, and this is not unique to him. It's so many times I've seen it everywhere. Townsend and Cloud also say it. It is far more effective to do your way, to act your way into new ways of thinking and feeling than it is to think and feel your way into new ways of doing. It's easier to commit and discipline your behavior to produce the feelings of faithfulness and love and delight than it is to try to love your way into doing the right things. Feelings are the fruit. How you feel is often the fruit of what you do, not the other way around. So what do we do with this? I mean, what do we do with this kind of bleak and beautiful picture? Well, first, I would encourage you to come and pray. Reconnect to the root. Spend time with God. Focus on grace in your life. Doing proceeds from being. If there is, in one of the first premises of emotional healthy spirituality, the course that we're doing, is that we cannot allow ourselves to become unbalanced, that we can't allow our doing for God somehow outstrip our being with God, because our being with God is what gives us that life. It's our being with God that gives that abundance of fruitfulness. And so, yes, should we bring discipline to our fruitfulness? Yes, we should. Should we ask the hard questions about how can I be more loving? How can I serve more effectively? How can I bring excellence to my gift? By all means, yes, 1,000 times yes. But not at the cost, never at the cost of your being with God. If you have to choose between volunteering, if you got 1 hour of time in your week to choose between abiding with Christ, reading the Word, praying, and soaking in God's presence, His love, His acceptance, His delight for you, and volunteering, I'm going to be the first person to tell you I want you to do that. I want you to spend it with Him. Because then at least you're alive. And here's the thing. If you do that, there's no way there's not going to be spillover into what you do. Because your being with God will always overflow into your doing for God. But your doing for God is never, ever, ever going to overflow into your being with God. What you do for God will never deepen your being with God. But your being with God will always overflow into your doing. So it's a very clear principle. And heaven forbid that our actions, our work, should ever exceed our character. Heaven forbid that our ministry should ever exceed our presence with Jesus. But too many times and too easily it slips. And so what is our invitation today? The so what of this is, as much as it is spending that time with God, reflecting, God, the fruit of my life, is it disobedience, anger, jealousy, contrariness, insensitivity? We come back to that communion picture that Mark brought up. We engage in communion in an unworthy manner because we do it without being mindful, without discerning the body. We gather for a feast. We gather for a meal together. We share and commemorate Christ's presence among us, and yet our minds are on ourselves. That's wrong. And yet our minds are on what we desire, on our comfort, on our table. And so the picture of communion that Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians, the picture of communion to sit at the table and lean back, as much as it is about presence, being in the presence to hear the very heartbeat of God, communion is also very deeply, how am I connecting to that heart of God at the table? But how am I also expressing that heart? How is that overflowing into a sensitive, shared heart to others at that same table? And so when we come to this time of communion, as we've come out of communion, it almost feels like backwards. I feel like we should be taking communion now. But as we think on communion, and as we come next week to our AGM, we stop for Sandwich Sunday. As we come into that space, asking yourself, how can I be Christ's presence here for others? How can I, as I take this little wafer and drink this little juice, how is it that in doing this, I might take on the body, the work of Christ, and the blood, the life of Christ into myself? And so as much as this is not about communion, it's about the remnant. The remnant is deeply about communion because it is where we find the root of those words, that notion of calm with and union, coming to a place of union, communion, and community, a place of sharing and togetherness. And so if you are new here, you're online, or if you're new to faith, or if you're young in faith, or if you're old to faith, it doesn't matter. Christ's call to you is come and join the remnant in faithfulness, in connection with Jesus. And if you're not connected, come and get connected. And if you are connected, come even deeper still, that you might overflow. As C.S. Lewis said in his Chronicles of Narnia, the last book, further up and further in, deeper in intimacy with God on a non-ending journey. And so whether you're church shopping, online, or in person, come and be found. It is time to find yourself at the table. Rest your head and hear the heart of God. And as always, go in grace.